In 1964, the Supremes were the biggest girl group in the world, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Beatles. But the woman who actually founded the group and named them, she was fired, stripped of her royalties, and banned from even calling herself a former Supreme. At age 32, she died in poverty, while Diana Ross became a global superstar. This is the dark, untold story of Florence Ballard, the ghost that Motown Records tried to erase. She stood on that stage, trembling under the weight of gold and memory. Jennifer Hudson had just won an Oscar for Dreamgirls, and as the applause roared like thunder, she lifted her eyes and said softly, "This award is for Florence Ballard, you will never be forgotten." But many in that glittering room didn't know the name. They clapped because the music swelled, not because they understood the ghost behind the song. Florence Ballard, the woman who built the Supremes before the world called them Diana Ross and the Supremes, was no longer alive to hear her name spoken again. Back in the 1960s, when America was split by color lines and courage, 3 young black women from Detroit became the sound of a new dream. Their music crossed racial boundaries, echoing from factory radios to ivory towers. But behind the polished smiles and perfect harmonies was a story Motown didn't want you to know. A story of a voice too soulful to be controlled, a woman too proud to be reshaped, a talent too real for the image Berry Gordy wanted to sell. This is not just about fame or failure. It is about what happens when the spotlight blinds the people who lit it. It makes you wonder how a woman who helped define an era could die forgotten, alone, at 32. And there is a reason her name still whispers through every song about survival. Detroit, 1943. The factories never slept. Engines roared through the night, as men in grease-stained shirts built the cars that carried America forward. Inside a small apartment in the Brewster projects, a baby girl cried. Her voice was already sharp, strong, and defiant. Her name was Florence Ballard. She was the 9th of 15 children. Her father worked for General Motors, and her mother kept the house together with hymns and hope. Money was short, but music was free, and Florence had plenty of that. By the time she was 5, neighbors called her the little girl with the grown woman's voice. They would open their windows just to hear her sing. They nicknamed her Flo, and sometimes Blondie, for her light complexion and auburn hair. But it wasn't her skin people remembered. It was that voice, thick with gospel and soaked in soul. When she sang, even the air seemed to hush. Growing up on Detroit's east side wasn't easy. The family moved often, chasing cheaper rent and safer streets. But in the Brewster projects, Florence found what would shape her life. A friend named Mary Wilson. Mary admired Flo's voice from the first moment she heard it echo through the hallway of their school. Together, they began entering talent shows, harmonizing in bathrooms and stairwells, pretending they were already stars. They made a promise to each other, a promise born out of teenage faith and hunger. If either of us ever gets a chance to sing for real, we bring the other along. That promise would define everything that came next. In those same neighborhoods lived another girl with a dream, Diana Ross. She was ambitious, polished, and sharp in a way that caught people's eyes. When a local manager named Milton Jenkins began looking for a girl group to mirror his male act, the Primes, Florence, Mary, and a friend named Betty McGlone stepped up. They became the Primettes. 3 girls, 1 borrowed microphone, and a dream louder than their city. Flo's deep, church-born tone anchored their harmonies. Even as teenagers, they rehearsed every afternoon after school, performing at cabarets, community centers, anywhere someone would listen. They didn't have money for fancy dresses, so they made their own. They didn't have cars, so they walked through snow to every gig. But when Flo opened her mouth to sing, people stopped talking. Men took off their hats. Women smiled. Children swayed. Detroit in those days was exploding with music. Berry Gordy had just launched Motown Records, turning an old house on West Grand Boulevard into what would become Hitsville, USA. Smokey Robinson, Marvin Gaye, Mary Wells, they were all finding their sound, and Florence wanted in. It was Diana Ross, who lived near Smokey, that convinced him to arrange an audition for the Primettes. They sang their hearts out for Berry Gordy. 3 trembling girls facing the man who was reshaping black music. He liked them, but he told them they were too young and needed to finish school first. It was a polite rejection, but Flo took it hard. She had spent her whole life waiting to be heard. Now she had to wait again. But another man in the room that day, producer Richard Morris, saw what Gordy didn't. He told them he would help polish their sound and get them real gigs. Under his wing, they sang backup for Wilson Pickett and other Detroit acts. Finally, they recorded their first single, Tears of Sorrow. It didn't chart, but it was the first time Florence's name sat on a record sleeve. Just as things began to move, tragedy struck. One night, after a local dance, Florence was attacked and assaulted by a neighborhood athlete she thought she could trust. It broke something inside her that music couldn't fix. She withdrew from school, stopped singing, and stopped laughing. Months passed before Mary and Diana convinced her to come back. When she finally did, her voice had changed. It was heavier now. burdened but powerful, carrying a pain that could not be taught. By then, Motown was growing fast. The girls spent every spare hour hanging around the studio, hoping to be noticed again. Florence babysat for money, Mary worked at a record shop, and Diana took a job as Berry Gordy's secretary. Every small connection mattered. Every handshake was a chance. When Gordy finally gave them studio time, they recorded Buttered Popcorn, with Flo on lead. The record didn't hit, but the power in her voice was undeniable. It was the kind of voice that didn't just sing, it testified. The road to stardom was still far away. But for Florence Ballard, the girl from the Brewster projects, the door to Motown had cracked open, and she was ready to sing her way through it. By 1963, Motown Records had become the heartbeat of Black America. Every hallway inside that modest Detroit house throbbed with sound. The steady stomp of the Funk Brothers, the laughter of young artists chasing fame, the hum of a new kind of freedom. For three girls who had once sung in stairwells, it felt like destiny had finally opened its door. They were no longer the Primettes. Florence had come up with a new name, the Supremes. Berry Gordy loved it, Diana didn't, but Gordy's word was law. At first, success came slow. Their early singles sank without a ripple. Around Hitsville, people joked and called them the no-hit Supremes. But Florence didn't lose faith. She believed that if the world could just hear them live, everything would change. Her voice wasn't made for background vocals. It was thunder disguised as silk. That thunder finally broke through in 1964. The song was Where Did Our Love Go? It wasn't written for them. The Marvelettes had turned it down. Even Diana hated it. But Motown's rules were simple. Do what Berry Gordy said. So they recorded it. 3 takes later, the sound that would change American pop history was born. When the record hit radio, it spread like wildfire. Black stations played it first, then white ones followed. Suddenly, those 3 girls from Detroit were on every jukebox from Harlem to Hollywood. They went from singing for nickels to headlining national tours, from the Chitlin Circuit to the Ed Sullivan Show. By the end of the year, Where Did Our Love Go hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and the Supremes were no longer just a girl group, they were a movement. Florence glowed under the spotlight, but inside, something was shifting. Berry Gordy's eyes were no longer on the group, they were on Diana. He believed Diana's lighter tone could cross over, reach white audiences, and soften the edges of soul. To him, Florence's deep, gospel tone was too raw and too black. But it was precisely that authenticity that had made the Supremes different. To silence it was to bleach the soul out of Motown. Still, the hits kept coming. Baby Love, Come See About Me, Stop in the Name of Love. Each one topped the charts, turning the Supremes into America's most successful female act. They became the first black girl group to perform at New York's Copacabana, a stage once closed to anyone who looked like them. Their gowns sparkled, their smiles flawless. They were elegance and excellence rolled into one. Yet the price of perfection was high. Florence saw her solos disappear, her name faded from headlines. She watched as Berry Gordy renamed them Diana Ross and the Supremes. It was more than branding, it was erasure. Every time the announcer said Diana Ross, Flo felt her history being rewritten. On stage, she still delivered. But offstage, she was breaking. Tour buses, rehearsals, interviews. 300 days a year, always moving, never resting. Diana had Berry, Mary kept quiet. Flo drowned her pain in silence and gin. She knew what the fans didn't. That Motown owned their lives. Every song, every cent, every smile. When they sold 1 million records, the girls barely saw $5,000 each. The dream they built was gilded, but it wasn't theirs. By 1966, the Supremes were international icons. They stood shoulder to shoulder with the Beatles on the charts. They sang in London, Paris, and Tokyo. Black women from Detroit, now symbols of American sophistication. But beneath the sequins, Florence felt invisible. Her voice, once the anchor, had been turned into background noise. She would stand backstage and listen as Diana sang leads meant for her. Sometimes she would hum along quietly, her eyes wet, the words swallowed before they left her mouth. The Supremes were everywhere. But Florence Ballard, the woman who named them, was already starting to disappear. Fame can be a slow kind of betrayal. It hugs you first, then it strangles. By 1967, Florence Ballard was exhausted. The Supremes had become global icons, but Flo's name was fading like an old photograph. Each time she looked at a new poster or headline, she saw it. Diana Ross and the Supremes. It wasn't just a title, it was a message. She was no longer the heart of the dream she started. Berry Gordy and Diana Ross were now inseparable, musically and personally. Their closeness meant decisions were made behind closed doors, and Florence was left outside. She wasn't invited to meetings, her solos were reassigned. Even her favorite performance piece, People, a song she once sang from the core of her being, was quietly given to Diana to sing every night. It was humiliation dressed as business. The pressure broke something inside her. She began showing up late, sometimes drunk, her laughter too loud, her eyes too tired. reporters whispered. Motown tightened the leash. Behind the glamour, Florence Ballard was slipping into the kind of darkness that no stage light could touch. The cracks became impossible to hide. During one performance, Berry Gordy criticized her weight before the show. On stage, Flo walked to the microphone, smirked, and deliberately pushed her stomach out in defiance. The audience laughed. Berry didn't. By morning, her time with the Supremes was over. Motown called it a temporary leave for exhaustion. But everyone inside Hitsville knew Florence Ballard had been erased. Her replacement was already chosen. Cindy Birdsong, from Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells. Patti was furious. She wouldn't speak to Diana Ross for almost 40 years. But Berry got what he wanted. A quieter, more controllable Supremes. For Florence, the fall was brutal. One week she was singing on the Ed Sullivan Show. The next, she was back home in Detroit, with nothing but memories and unpaid royalties. She married Thomas Chapman, Berry Gordy's former chauffeur. A good man at first, then not so good. He became her manager, but success never came back. She sued Motown for $8.7 million in unpaid royalties and damages, but the case collapsed. Her lawyer embezzled what little she won, just $160,000 in back royalties. As part of the settlement, she was forbidden from using the name former Supreme. Even her own legacy was off limits. Flo signed with ABC Records and recorded 2 singles. It Doesn't Matter How I Say It and Love Ain't Love. They vanished without airplay. Her album was shelved. The industry that once called her a star now treated her like an inconvenience. Without shows, without income, she sold her house, moved in with her sister, and went on welfare. There were nights when she didn't eat, so her 3 daughters could. The loneliness grew heavier. There were rumors of abuse at home. She began drinking again, not for joy, but to forget. In Detroit, the city that had once echoed her voice, now barely remembered her name. In interviews from that time, Florence still smiled. She said she forgave Diana. She said she believed she would sing again. But her eyes told the truth, the kind of tired that sleep can't cure. Every dream she had built had been stolen, reshaped, or sold under someone else's name. She wasn't angry anymore, just hollow. By 1975, there were glimmers of hope. A small settlement check, a modest new house. She began attending church again, reading her Bible, and talking about writing a book. She even reconnected with Diana Ross. For the first time in years, she seemed ready to start over. But fate, or something darker, had other plans. Because within a year, Florence Ballard, the woman who once sang to heal the world, would be gone. And her death would raise more questions than answers. When Florence Ballard died in February 1976, the world barely noticed. There were no front-page headlines and no tributes on national television. The newspapers that once printed her photo beside the Beatles now gave her 2 paragraphs and a photo cropped in half. In an America obsessed with fame, there was little room for remembering the woman who had lost hers. But to understand Florence's story, you have to understand the time she lived in. The 1960s were a revolution. Civil rights, women's rights, and black pride rising from centuries of silence. Motown had been more than a record label. It was a weapon of soft power, reshaping how America heard and saw black people. For the first time, black voices filled white living rooms, elegant, refined, unstoppable, and the Supremes stood at the center of it all. Polished, smiling, harmonizing perfection. Yet within that perfection lived a contradiction. To cross over, Motown had to smooth the edges of blackness, lighten the sound, tame the soul, and soften the anger. Florence Ballard was everything the system feared. Too emotional, too real, too unapologetically black. Her voice carried the weight of gospel and the grief of Detroit streets. Berry Gordy couldn't market that to white America, so the industry turned down her volume until she vanished. In the years after her death, America continued to celebrate Diana Ross, the star, the icon, the crossover dream. But beneath that shining success, many saw a deeper truth. Florence's story was not an accident. It was a pattern, the erasure of the raw, authentic black woman in favor of a version that fit the market. The music industry had always done this. From Billie Holiday to Etta James, from Sister Rosetta Tharpe to Florence Ballard, their brilliance built the foundation, but others reaped the credit. Still, time has a way of restoring voices that were silenced. In the decades that followed, historians, journalists, and artists began to revisit her legacy. Jennifer Hudson's dedication at the Oscars wasn't just a gesture, it was a correction. It was a statement that the dream of Motown had been written in Florence's blood, too. Across the Atlantic, British journalists and soul collectors unearthed her early recordings. In Europe, black music enthusiasts began to treat her like a lost saint of Motown. Books like The Lost Supreme and Dream Girl, My Life as a Supreme, retold her story from the inside, peeling back decades of silence. Documentaries reintroduced her as more than a tragedy, as a woman who dared to exist in full color, even when the world wanted grayscale. In America, her story resonated with a new generation of black women artists. Women like Beyoncé, Jill Scott, Jennifer Hudson, and Andra Day. They saw in her a warning and an inheritance. Florence had lived through every contradiction they were still fighting. Visibility without power, recognition without respect, and talent without ownership. Her life became a mirror for the conversation about representation, exploitation, and survival in black entertainment. Even today, when people speak of Motown, her name floats just beneath the surface, not forgotten, just waiting for the truth to rise again. Because Florence Ballard's story isn't only about what was lost, it's about what America refused to face. That behind every polished pop dream, there was a woman like her. Powerful, proud, and punished for being both. If you listen closely, you can still hear her in every soulful run, in every broken note that carries too much pain to be pretty. That is the sound of the real Supremes. Not the ones dressed in matching gowns, but the ones who carried gospel in their bones. Florence Ballard was more than a singer. She was a revelation, and America wasn't ready for her truth. The winter of 1976 was bitter in Detroit. Snow covered the empty streets where once, music spilled out of open doors. Inside a modest home on Buena Vista Street, Florence Ballard, the voice that once moved millions, sat quietly with her 3 daughters, planning her return. She was writing a book. She was praying more. She had started to believe, once again, that God hadn't forgotten her. Then, one night, her heart simply stopped. 32 years old, gone before the world could make things right. At her funeral, the church overflowed. Aretha Franklin's father delivered the sermon. Stevie Wonder, the Four Tops, and hundreds of fans came to say goodbye. Diana Ross appeared late, and the crowd booed. Berry Gordy didn't come. He sent flowers with 2 words, "Goodbye, Flo." Outside, as the casket was lifted into the hearse, fans climbed onto the car, reaching for her flowers, desperate to take home a piece of her story. Because even in death, Florence Ballard still belonged to the people. Her sister later said Florence had been afraid, that she knew too much, that she had said too much. Rumors circled for decades about what really happened. But maybe the truth is simpler and sadder. She died of heartbreak long before her heart gave out. In the years that followed, the silence around her name began to crack. Writers, filmmakers, and musicians pieced her back into history. Jennifer Hudson's words, "You will never be forgotten," became a promise America finally kept. Today, Florence Ballard stands not just as a cautionary tale, but as a cornerstone of Motown's soul. Her voice, buried beneath decades of polish, still echoes in the music of every black woman who dares to sing without apology. Because what Florence gave the world was more than songs. She gave it courage. The courage to exist loudly, even when the world wants your silence. She showed us that talent without protection can become tragedy. But truth, even whispered, can outlive the ones who tried to erase it. Some stories end without closure. But dignity doesn't need applause. To the women who built dreams they were never allowed to keep, this story is for you. To the ones whose names were erased so others could shine, we see you. And to Florence Ballard, the lost supreme, may your voice keep rising, forever, through every note that still dares to be free.